much for joining us here this morning for what I hope will be a very good session. This is the second of our webinar sessions, making sense of environmental gain. We'd originally hoped to run this session as one of our business breakfasts in April, but obviously events overtook us and we weren't able to do that. So sadly you missed the breakfast, but I think you also missed that engagement with people and the chance to meet and discuss ideas. And I hope very much that you'll take that opportunity to maybe do that after the event. Certainly there'll be an opportunity for you to contact those of us that are involved, and I hope you'll do that. The last few months have undoubtedly seen us get to grips with many different ways of working and interacting, and I think that's been interesting, and it's been great to see how people have risen to that challenge. But the other thing that's come right to the fore is, I think, an enhanced understanding of the environment and the green spaces around us. They've been so important to people right across the country in relation to getting out, exercise, health and well-being, and certainly this is something that I think we've seen a fundamental change with, and it's been recognised in relation to how the government is thinking about the way forward, thinking about our green recovery, and we heard announcements earlier this week about funding coming forward for that. And it's excellent from a business point of view that it links very closely with our vision at Lockhart Garrett to see land managed and used in a sustainable way. For those of you that aren't interacting with us all the time, our services are spread over these 5 areas, and obviously very good specialist teams in those areas, and you can see the characters who lead those teams, all of whom have got expertise in their areas in front of you now. And one of the things that's been particularly good from my point of view over the last few months is we've started to see how these teams can interact together really effectively in this environmental net gain space, and certainly that's the way we see things moving forward. We're also working with partners in this area, and I'm really delighted to be joined today in this webinar with Jim Rouquette from Natural Capital Solutions. Jim has a huge amount of experience in this area, did a lot of work in the nature improvement area in the River Nen, mapping that, looking at the way that natural capital could play a part with that, and thinking about how that can work effectively. And also I'm delighted to be joined by Andra Stopforth, who will be joining us for the Q&A session. Andra, again, a lot of experience in this area, really focused on how we can deliver the environmental improvements that we want to see with growth, genuine growth, and now very instrumental in sort of bringing together some of the policy documents and so on that we're going to see to help guide us in this area going forward. So over the next 45 minutes or so, we'll be covering a couple of presentations. I'll introduce, just give a bit of policy context and background, but then hand over really to Jim to get into the nuts and bolts of this. Get into the nuts and bolts of understanding what we're talking about. Natural capital, environmental net gain, what is it, how does it all mesh together? And also picking up on a case study where Jim and I and Andra have been working very closely together at the Tresham Garden Village, and seeing how natural capital has been applied to that scheme and has helped to shape it. And then looking at ways in which environmental net gain can be delivered going forward. We've also got a bit of audience participation for you there. At that point, we've got a little poll that we'd like to get people to interact with. That'll come up on the screens at that point in the presentation. And then we'll have an open Q&A panel session, and I hope very much you'll engage with that. And you saw how to do that at the start, but you can use the Q&A function. Raise your hands, we'll come back to you with that. So just a bit of policy context. Really, I've just taken this back to the 2011 white paper, where the government at the time said that we wanted to be the first, they wanted to be the first generation to leave our natural environment in better state than they found it. And their thinking at this time was very much guided by the Natural Capital Committee, which was formed on the back of this. And the Natural Capital Committee has regularly reported on the state of the environment in the intervening period. And unfortunately, we're still seeing deterioration. We're not seeing this anticipated change. We saw the 25-year environment plan come forward in 2018, shaping the policy guided by the National Capital Committee. But again, their report in 2020 on progress to date was still saying we're not going fast enough, we're not doing well enough, we're not integrating our environmental 25-year plan aspirations into legislation. But we started to see some change. I think many of us were surprised by the decision at Heathrow based on the zero carbon target by 2050. And it's starting to give us an understanding that legislation is coming into play. Those of us in the rural sector are aware of the agriculture bill that's currently going through Parliament, stalled by COVID-19, but seeing a fundamental a change in the way that agriculture is going to be supported, with a move away from direct payments to payments for public goods and environmental net gain, very much integrated into that. And more recently, the Environment Bill, again, this is the critical piece, which is going to see a fundamental change in the way things are done. And obviously within the Environment Bill, a lot of wider legislation, but very much at the heart of it, this mandatory requirement for biodiversity net gain. And one of the things I often find is it gets confused is biodiversity net gain, environmental net gain, how do they mesh together? And I hope after this morning's presentation you'll have a much better understanding of that. But certainly biodiversity net gain is the focus at the moment. The legislation is going to take things to a different level, from the aspirations in the MPPF and probably in a lot of local planning policies, to a mandatory requirement to deliver 10% biodiversity net gain over the baseline position at the end of a development. And this is going to be a high bar, possibly requiring maybe 30%, maybe more of the site to be put over to biodiversity uses. It's going to need careful thinking, and it's going to be measured using the DEFRA metric, which is still going through the iteration process, and Jim will say a little bit more about in a bit. It's going to require us to be thinking about our mitigation and avoidance, both on-site, off-site, and potentially even going to the Secretary of State to buy biodiversity credits to meet the expectations. The bill also covers local nature recovery strategies, where local authorities are going to have to put together plans to show where they want to see biodiversity and nature dealt with. And we've also got legal frameworks coming into play in the form of conservation covenants to allow some agreements to be set up to allow that to be done. There is still this aspiration for wider environmental net gain, and hopefully you'll have an understanding of how these two things fit together. But biodiversity is only one part of the picture. Carbon, water quality, air quality, health and well-being, all critical to that environmental net gain picture and additional to where we are in terms of biodiversity. Certainly the way that the legislation has been guided around good practice and principles, and the documents that have been produced by CERA and SIEM are right at the heart of this. And it's useful to get to grips with these principles and start to understand where they're coming from. The mitigation hierarchy is still very much there. Avoid if you possibly can. Mitigate on site, and only at the last minute think about compensation and off-site. Avoidance, key, and raising up the agenda. We have this requirement to protect irreplaceable habitats, in particular ancient woodland, veteran trees, SSSIs, SACs. If you're damaging and losing irreplaceable habitat in a development, then you will not be able to meet the biodiversity net gain requirements as it stands at the moment. So thinking about how those can be avoided, how those can be protected is going to be key. Engagement, making sure that we're talking to the people that understand those environmental requirements, local authorities understand local nature recovery strategies and so on, again key. And we come back to the measurable outcomes, using the DEFRA metric to make sure that we understand how things are working in practice, where the numbers sit, and where the benefits are. Sustainability, also important. We're going to be expected to deliver these benefits for 30 years. And the local authorities are going to have a legal obligation to monitor that and communicate that monitoring, communicate positions so that it is clear for everybody to see. So before I hand over to Jim, what should we be doing now? Well, it's really critical, I think, that people start to get an understanding of this. They start to understand where their baseline sits, where they sit in the mix. They do trial assessments both on existing schemes. How would this scheme be impacted by this change in legislation? And how might new schemes coming forward be impacted? I need to be looking at those implications and those opportunities, seeing where they can maybe shape things, thinking about what additional land may be required to deliver biodiversity, what other options may need to be thought about. And also to make sure that they don't let the biodiversity tail wag the dog, that we're still thinking about this wider environmental net gain and making sure that our places are good for the people that are going to inhabit them, and making sure that we can work with people and biodiversity in harmony. Now, at this point, I'm going to hand over to Jim. So if the technology works as it should, Jim should be able to take over and share his screen. And I'll come back then at the end of Jim's presentation, and we'll pick up with the Q&A. So Jim, can I hand over to you, please?
Thank you very much, John. So today I'm going to talk about making sense of environmental gain. I should just say very quickly that John has already introduced me, but I'm director of, or one of the directors of Natural Capital Solutions, which is a small specialist consultancy, and we specialize specifically in everything to do with natural capital, ecosystem services and biodiversity. But today I'm going to focus on environmental net gain. And I'm going to talk about 4 different things. So first of all, I'm going to start with a very brief introduction about what is natural capital and why it's important. This is really, I'm sure a lot of you will know this already, but this is just to make sure that everyone is sort of on the same page. I then want to get into a bit of a technical bit on what is environmental net gain and how it can be measured. Then I'm going to introduce a case study on mapping natural capital and assessing net gain at Tresham Garden Village. And then I'm going to finish with a bit on practical ways that we can deliver environmental gain and how this links back to policy as well, that John has already introduced. So very briefly, what is natural capital? Well, it's been defined by the UK Natural Capital Committee, which is one of the most widely used definitions. It's elements of nature that directly or indirectly produce value or benefits to people. This includes ecosystems, species, freshwater, land, minerals, the air and oceans, as well as natural processes and functions. So it is essentially all aspects of the natural environment. Then that natural capital is therefore this stock of natural assets. And this stock of assets produces a range of ecosystem services that provide benefits to people. Now, these ecosystem services are usually divided into different categories, as shown here. You have the provisioning services, which are the products that are typically obtained from ecosystems such as food and timber and water. You have regulating services, which are the benefits obtained from environmental processes. So this is things like air quality enhancement, climate regulation, carbon sequestration, pollination, and so on. And then the third section, which has become more and more important in recent years, as people have realized the sort of wider intangible benefits that people gain from the natural environment. These are known as the cultural services and include things like recreation, aesthetic experiences, and health and well-being. And this, as John has already mentioned, the COVID-19 situation has again shown the importance of our ability to be able to get out into the countryside or into parks or into green space in general. Now, it's also true that quality green spaces deliver a range of benefits that have real value to society. So it's about, they can be used to create community well-being, enhance livability and sense of place. So the principles of natural capital are very relevant to the planning and development sector, and to a whole other series of sectors as well. And what we can start saying as well, if we can do a comprehensive assessment of natural capital and the benefits that it's providing, that will enable planners and developers to deliver high quality and also sustainable places that are really valued by society. Why is natural capital important? Well, I've already touched on many aspects, but here's just three quotes to get over the point. Natural capital has inherent value. It provides a huge range of services which can have great monetary value, both as public goods and as private goods. It's also really important that businesses take it into account. It is hugely important, both as a resource that goes into businesses, and also many businesses are ultimately highly dependent on aspects of natural capital. So it makes business sense. And finally here, it makes sense in terms of planning and development, in that if we can start delivering these positive outcomes, you will get less local opposition to development. And as the government wrote in the 25-year plan, it will shorten the planning process, cut operating costs for infrastructure, increase the desirability of new homes. So moving on to environmental net gain, the obvious question is, what is net gain? So the important thing to say here is that there is not actually an agreed definition of environmental net gain yet. But what we do know is that it encompasses biodiversity net gain and also natural capital net gain. So there's sort of consensus is emerging that to achieve environmental net gain, you need to have biodiversity net gain as your fundamental and first block, plus on top of that, natural capital net gain. So, and if I'm talking about these two terms, we also need to define what they are. So biodiversity net gain can be defined, it's an approach that leaves biodiversity in a measurably better state after development than before. So this has been defined, and it also has a standard way of assessing it, which is using the biodiversity metric 2.0. Natural capital net gain, on the other hand, has no fixed definition, but essentially it's about an increase in ecosystem service provision after a development compared to the baseline, which was before development. But the complications are that there are many different ecosystem services, so it can refer to single services or to the majority of services provided at a site. And in terms of the legal basis for all of this, so we're now at the situation where biodiversity net gain is being mandated. So as part of the Environment Bill that will likely get assent in the autumn, this is becoming a mandatory approach for all new developments under the Town and Country Planning Act. Natural capital net gain, and therefore the wider approach of environmental net gain, is currently an ambition. It's stated in the 25-year plan, it's been restated several times since. The government would like to move towards environmental net gain, but at this stage it's not mandated, but it is likely to be in the future. So starting with biodiversity net gain, the diagram here shows a simple diagrammatic representation of what happens if you put in a new development and you lose your natural environment. You're leading to net loss. If you replace the same amount of natural environment that you take away, that is known as no net loss. But what we're trying to get to is a situation of net gain, where you actually put in or enhance the environment to a greater extent afterwards than before, in which case you're talking about net gain. And the policy that is going through Parliament at the moment will be to deliver 10% net gain in biodiversity. One of the good guidance on this, on biodiversity net gain, is the Good Practice Guide for Development, so that's worth looking at if you have a chance. And as John mentioned at the start, this very much follows the mitigation hierarchy. So you have your impact, and you have to avoid your impact as much as possible. Stuff that you can't avoid, you need to minimize. If you can't, the things that you can't minimize, you need to start restoring. And then if you can't do any of those, then you need to start thinking about net gain. you need to start thinking about the positive impact and how you can get net gain. And if you're going above the bar of where you started with, you can start, that's where you are actually getting net gain. It's assessed using the biodiversity metric 2.0, as I mentioned. This has so far been released only as a beta version, and it was subject to a consultation over the winter and is still undergoing review and is likely to change. There's been a lot of issues raised about it, but there is guidance out there. There's a user guide, there's a calculation tool that you can use, and it essentially is based on these 4 categories. The first 2 being the more significant ones: assessment of distinctiveness, which is a score, habitats get a score out of 8 depending on the type of habitat that they are. And then the second important one is condition, and habitats get scored out of a maximum score of 3 depending on how good the condition of the habitat is. There's also multipliers that you take that include strategic significance and connectivity that can slightly increase the score that you're given if your site is in a significant location and well connected to other habitats. So in terms of calculating biodiversity units, it is pretty much as I've just outlined. You get your area of land for each particular habitat, and you multiply the area by the distinctiveness score, the condition score, and then it gets adjusted a little bit further by the strategic location score and the connectivity score. And this gives you overall a number of biodiversity units that you get. Then you calculate this for your site before development, and then you calculate it for the site after development as well. The one thing to bear in mind as well is that if you are creating new habitats at a site, then you also need to run a number of weightings that downweight the score that you will get. So you have to consider how difficult it is to create the habitat, the time to target condition, and overall risk. And this, once you do that, that will reduce your score a little bit for new, or in some cases quite a lot, in fact, for new habitats. You calculate the biodiversity units for post-development situation, and you compare the score that you get before and afterwards. And you will need to be delivering a 10% higher score after the development than before the development. And if you're not able to achieve this on site, then that's where offsetting comes in, and you need to start delivering these biodiversity units off site. In terms of assessing natural capital net gain, again, as I mentioned, there isn't a standard approach yet for this, but there are a number of techniques out there. So here the aim is to understand the change in ecosystem services provided by the habitats at the site beforehand compared to afterwards. And there are, it's probably sensible to divide this sort of into 3 sort of broad approaches that you can take. You take a really simple approach, which is sort of based around qualitative scoring based on expert opinion. You can take a metric approach, which becomes much more standardized, and the 2 main ways of doing this are using the ecometric or the natural capital planning tool. And in these cases, I'm not going to go into the details in the talk today, but in this case, the area of each habitat is multiplied by expert-derived scores on on the provision of services provided by each habitat. Or you can go for a full assessment. And to do a full assessment, this involves a detailed quantitative modeling and mapping of ecosystem services, and also considering not only supply but demand for services. So this has the advantage that it's spatial, so you can start using it to really start to get informing about your design and start to make changes. It's also, you can include monetary valuation and through the process of natural capital accounting should you wish as well. It's a very brief example of a qualitative ecosystem services assessment. So this is at the simplest end of the assessment range. So here we are simply scoring each ecosystem service that you can see around the spider diagram out of a maximum score of 3. So a score of 0 means that the site is providing is not providing that service. A score of 3 means it's providing that service highly significantly. And so here we can simply do an expert score on the baseline provision and the master plan provision, and you see this is a real development site that you can see. I won't name the development site, but it's a real one. You see in this particular case, you can see quite quickly that the site, after the master plan has been assessed, you see it improves ecosystem services for health and well-being and for recreation and tourism. But for most other ecosystem services, actually negative. It's scoring inside the black line. So services are getting less good in most situations here. So this will quickly highlight areas that will need to be looked at in terms of the master plan. And how do we carry out a natural capital assessment of a proposed development? Well, there are a number of steps to take in a sort of logical flow that you can use. The first step is you have to compile an asset register for before and after the development. This is natural capital assets, so this is essentially looking at the habitats that you have at the site before and after development. You then need to assess biodiversity net gain, as the whole process is about biodiversity net gain plus natural capital net gain. You then need to determine the flow of benefits, which is the ecosystem services before and after the development. And using that, you can then, from that, you can assess the natural capital net gain that you've achieved. Next, you can start to modify the designs to enhance biodiversity and natural capital benefits based on the results that you've had. And think about offsetting where necessary. And finally, if you want to, you can think about completing a natural capital account. This is if you want monetary values for your ecosystem services, this is where you go about doing that. So I'm now going to talk through a case study where I illustrate a lot of these examples and a lot of these principles. So this is around natural capital mapping and assessment of environmental net gain at Tresham Garden Village. And this was funded as part of Garden Communities and via East Northamptonshire Council and the joint North Northamptonshire Joint Planning Unit. And as John mentioned at the start, Lockhart Garrett were involved with this as well as Natural Capital Solutions. So Tresham Garden Village, for anybody who hasn't heard of it, is a proposed new garden village development near Corby. The plan is to build 1,500 houses, but also all the necessary primary and secondary school to go with it, employment zones, and all the necessary associated infrastructure. But as it's a garden village, green spaces are a really important feature of the site, and it involves a large area of new woodland planting. So we wanted to know, what will be the impact of the development on natural capital and ecosystem services? Can we use the assessment approach to improve the master plan to deliver more? And can we use this as a learning exercise to see how can these ideas that we're developing be used in other developments and taken forward? So this is the site before development. You can see that it is an old airfield site. The grey lines are the old runways, and it's surrounded predominantly by arable land, which is in the yellow. There are patches of grassland as well, and there's an area of woodland to the top right of the picture in brown. This was the early version of the master plan, and you can see that the development is based around sort of 3 main zones of new homes. But then within and immediately around the zones, you've got lots of new parkland and green spaces, and then surrounding the housing areas, you've got a large area of new brown areas there, which is new woodland planting. You've got woodland planting now going around most of the site. So we wanted to know what was the impact on ecosystem services. So here we modeled and mapped a whole series of different ecosystem services, 10 different ecosystem services on the list there, and we also assessed biodiversity as well. And for all of these, we mapped the supply of that service, but also wherever feasible, we also looked at demand for the services as well. I'm going to show you two examples. So this is air quality regulation capacity. So this is effectively looking at the ability of vegetation to ameliorate air pollution, things like particulate matter and nitrogen oxides and so on. You see the baseline position on the left of the screen and the master plan position afterwards. And you can see the red line zone for the development there. So you can see beforehand, much of the area was sort of, I should say red means that the site is delivering high levels of the service, and the bluer the colours means the lower the levels of the service. So you can see what happens is once we put the master plan in, you have actually the centre of the site has gone a deeper shade of blue because you now have more sealed surfaces which are not able to absorb air pollution at all. But in the areas around the development, there's a lot more red areas and yellow areas, which are areas which are absorbing air pollution. So you're actually having large areas of extra air regulation capacity going on. But because we also want to think about demand, I've zoomed out a bit here in these maps, but this is looking at the demand for air quality regulation, which depends on how much air pollution there is, but also the societal need for air quality regulation, which depends on things like population density and health. You can see from the baseline position, the large area of red and orange colours is the town of Corby, which is nearby. And you can see for the red line boundary itself, there was, before the development, there was actually very little demand for air quality regulation at the site. But by building the new development, you are inherently increasing the demand for air quality regulation. So this is something to consider. We can't just keep the status quo, because if you've put in a new development, you will be generating demand, which we need to think about. Second example is accessible nature capacity. So this is effectively looking at, is there access to the natural environment, and how natural is the natural environment? Because there's been a lot of work to show that people get more well-being benefits from areas of land that they perceive to be more natural. You can see the baseline position, the blue lines are simply the footpaths. The only access to this land was public footpaths. So this is providing a fairly low level of the service, whereas once the new development has been put in place, you are creating these large areas of new woodland which will all be publicly accessible. So you are creating and also the new parkland and grassland areas. So you're creating far more access to nature. So as well as showing the individual maps, we can start to provide scores for all of these. I should just say, forgot about this slide. We can also think about demand for the services. And again, for accessible nature, you can see the town of Corby, which is driving demand, but the demand at the site itself was not very high before development, whereas demand for access to nature increases once you put the new development in place, as you get people living at the site. As I was just saying, we can, as well as showing maps, we can also start to score this. So this is where we actually start to think about scoring environmental net gain. So here you can see the blue lines are the scores for each ecosystem service before development, and the orangey lines show the situation with the master plan. And you can see here that for the vast majority of the services, the bars for post-development are higher than for baseline. So you're actually getting an increase in services almost across the board. The big exception is agricultural production, which is the second column from the right, where there's a big drop in that, but this is to be expected because you're taking arable land out of production. And also we identified that there was a small drop in water flow, which is something that we could address through the design, through enhancing SUDS features. So what we can do is we we presented these results to a whole series of stakeholders and had a stakeholder workshop and started thinking about, well, how can we improve the design further? And these were some of the ideas that they came up with. So it involved improving the SUDS features, putting in a woodland strip to protect an area of woodland from the employment area, changing habitats in certain situations, improving public access, and looking at all these factors that we could enhance. And then what we did was we looked at how this would impact on the ecosystem service provision. And this graph, the first two bars on each part, so the blue bar and the red bar, are the same as you saw on the previous diagram. But the green bar shows the ecosystem service provision after the new changes have been made. And although it's quite subtle, the changes are fairly small. In almost all the cases, these bars, the green bars, are slightly higher than the middle red bars, showing that the design changes that we've made have actually enhanced ecosystem service delivery further. So we're enhancing net gain, environmental net gain even more. I'm not going to go into this in detail today, but we also did a natural capital account. So this is putting a monetary value on the costs and the benefits of the natural environment at this site. So this is about working out initially the physical flow of benefits and then putting a value on that. So just as one example, carbon sequestration, which I'm sure many people are familiar with, we can work out the tons of CO2 sequestered by the new woodland, and then we can use the government price for a ton of carbon to work out the monetary benefit of that. So you can see here the overall results. This is in terms of present value. So this is looking at the results over 30 years. We can compare the baseline position to the master plan, and you can see that there is a significant change. You go from approximately £1 million of benefits under the baseline condition to £15 million of benefits after the master plan has been implemented over 30 years. And we can also think about this in relation to costs. So the capital costs of putting in the schemes, the natural environment features that we've been talking about, are a little bit short of £1 million over 30 years. £1 million up front. Maintenance costs over 30 years are about £1.5 million. But even taking these into account, the overall natural capital value of the project, it was delivering about £2 million worth of benefits, of net benefits, over 30 years. Under the previous situation, this will go to £14 million of benefits over 30 years, which is a net increase of approximately 12 million. And we can also plot how this changes over those 30 years. So it takes about 15 years for this site to be developed. So as people gradually move in and the number of people living on the site increases, we get this increase in the particularly high bars there are for physical health and for recreation, and these increase as people move in. We also find that carbon sequestration and air purification, which are the blue and yellow lines next down, increase as the trees mature as well. And you can see how this changes in the relative size of the benefits. So some of the key points were that the proposal does broadly increase both supply and demand for most ecosystem services. New woodland around the built zone is particularly beneficial for this. But we were able to increase ecosystem service delivery further through this process, through the assessment and through a stakeholder workshop. And we can use this process to evaluate environmental net gain and determine the need for offsetting. And that final point I was making in the last slide is that we are having an increase in value of 12 million over 30 years compared to the baseline. So I want to finish with a few slides about how we can actually go about delivering environmental net gain. So a lot of the things that we're talking about here aren't particularly difficult. There are a lot of easy wins that can be implemented at new developments. So for example, it's important to maximize the creation of green infrastructure wherever possible and increase access to green space as well. And this has a really big impact on the services of recreation and access to nature. We need to think about creating and expanding woodland, and this also goes for street trees, which are really important, and integrating trees throughout developments. Trees are particularly good at delivering a whole range of services. For example, carbon sequestration, air quality, noise, water flow, and a whole series of others as well. And increasing these at a site is really good for increasing your environmental impact. But location of trees is also really important. So if you want your trees to have an effect at reducing air pollution, they need to be planted close to air pollution sources. So this typically means close to main roads. So if you have a main road going through your site, plant street trees along it if you can. Another factor that we want to do is, if possible, is to limit the amount of amenity grassland, which is not particularly interesting, but rather create meadows wherever you can and more complex habitats. This will be better for biodiversity. It will increase water flow, improve water flow regulation, enhance pollination, and so on. And installing suds and green roofs are important in their own right, and these deliver a wide range of services, not just about water flow. They also help improve water quality, air quality, local climate regulation, pollination, provide access or enhance biodiversity, and so on. And this is not all about wins for people and for the environment. This is also potentially about delivering wins for the developer as well, because there is generally little cost involved in many of these measures. For one thing, we're getting to the point where these are policy requirements anyway. We need to be thinking about doing these things anyway, and putting these things in will enhance development. There is growing evidence that people like buying houses if there are features in that improve biodiversity and improve access to nature and so on. And this is what's doing that, and developers can use it as a way of selling and marketing the site. And it can also be used to meet corporate social responsibility. Then, as I mentioned earlier on, it can't always be done on site, so we need to think about offsetting. So if we're trying to achieve 10% biodiversity net gain, then in many ways, in many cases, this is going to need to be done off-site through offsetting. And the way that we see natural capital net gain is that we can deliver this in conjunction with biodiversity net gain. It's not a separate thing. So if you're delivering your biodiversity net gain anyway, but you need to improve your carbon, then we can start thinking about focusing on biodiversity net gain on woodland, and then we can start thinking about the carbon that you'll be delivering as well, for example. We can also think about the wider evidence base for green infrastructure, and looking at where you can install new GI that will help within the wider sort of landscape setting. Other examples, in Northamptonshire, there is a mitigation scheme for the special protection area, whereby houses within a certain distance of the SPA developers have to pay a contribution for mitigation, and this is a sort of similar ideas. And finally, briefly, we can mention the ideas of local natural capital plans. These are being promoted currently by DEFRA, and through local natural capital plans, we can come up with a prioritised pipeline of projects, and then we can start thinking about when we need to fund offsetting. The offsetting can go into these prioritised projects, which can be delivering multiple benefits. Bringing it back to the policy, this is all being delivered through the mechanism both of national policy that you've heard about, but also through local planning policy. I'm not going to go into the details of this at all now, but within North Northamptonshire, there's going to be a supplementary planning document that's currently being written on natural capital. And the principle is that the sort of scale of work you need to do on natural capital has to be appropriate to the size of the development. So if you're just a small development, a minor development, then the effort you will need to go to will be smaller, but you'll still need to do certain things, whereas the scale of the assessment process will be larger. as the scale of the development goes up. So I'll leave that there for people to refer to afterwards. Just very briefly, I've been talking about development here, but the same principles apply within the land management sector as well, via the new ELM scheme that's being developed as part of the agriculture bill, which is very much thinking about the same ideas of delivering public goods alongside the agricultural produce that people deliver. It's about public money going for public goods, and it's about payment for outcomes and so on. I won't go into details now because time is short, but if anyone wants to talk about that afterwards, we can. So to wrap up, making sense of environmental net gain, which is what we've been trying to talk about. A natural capital approach is now embedded across multiple government policies. This isn't just an environmental policy or a biodiversity policy. This is also about land management and agricultural policy. It links in heavily with climate change policies as well. And obviously with the development sector, planning and development, it's a key, it's coming as a key part of that too. The natural capital approach provides a common framework for understanding environmental net gain and the benefits that can be provided by new developments and the natural environment. Biodiversity net gain of 10% will shortly be required for all new developments under the Town and Country Planning Act. That's mandatory. That's going to become mandatory, but there's going to be a move towards environmental net gain in the future. This presents a huge opportunity, in my opinion, in terms of enhancing our environment and creating really nice livable spaces as well. And it's important to say that local policy is a key thing here, integrating these ideas into local plans. SPDs are starting to be produced and are another important factor here. The first step that we need to understand is your natural capital baseline. Once we know the baseline, we can then start thinking about natural capital and ecosystem services delivered at the site, at these developments, before and after the development, and use that to determine net impact and enhance design. If we map the spatial location and distribution of these benefits, we can then start thinking, that starts to give us valuable extra additional information, especially when we start thinking about the benefits in relation to demand and how that can change as well. And finally, we can think about natural capital valuation and accounting. This is a really useful way of highlighting the value of the natural environment and how much it delivers compared to the costs. And some of these things are things that would otherwise remain hidden. I'm sorry I've slightly overrun, sorry John, but thank you very much for listening. And I will hand back to John now.
Jim, thank you. I think you've covered a huge amount of ground and you've done it extremely clearly, extremely well. And we've already got quite a few questions coming in, and I'm sure we'll see a few more. So I'm just going to swap over to share my screen, and then we'll go from there. Let's just move on. So we've now got an opportunity for questions, but just before we launch into the Q&A session, and thank you for those of you who are already submitting questions, just before we launch into that, I'm going to ask Vicky, who's working very hard behind the scenes, to launch a little poll. So we've got a bit of audience participation. So what I'd like you to do over the next minute or so is just quickly run through the questions, which are all fairly basic, and pick up on some of the themes that we've been sharing. Let us have your answers, and then we'll be able to come back to you with an indication of where that is, and then we'll launch into the question and answer from there. So please take the next just few minutes or a minute or so just to go through the questions. Right, Vicky, I don't know if you're able to share some results that we've got. Right, okay, so we've got there a few of the questions coming up now, so I can see those. So on that question, have you undertaken a biodiversity net gain assessment? Obviously 69% of you no. Have you undertaken a natural capital assessment? 89% no. So these are things that are going to certainly have to be looked at in the going forward. Have any authorities required a biodiversity net gain assessment? And again, 61% no, 39% yes. Very useful to see that. Do you think natural capital and environmental net gain are the way forward to secure a better places? Very, very strong feeling that that is something that we need to see. So 81% there, so very interesting to see that. And finally, do you think developers and landowners promoters will see this as beneficial? And great to see that we've got sort of 50% of our audience thinking that it is a positive. So what I'm going to do, I'll just close that poll now, and I'll ask Andra and Jim to open their video and open their microphones so that we can see everybody. And I will stop sharing so that we've got us all up on the screen. So what I'm going to do now is just to pick up on some of the questions, and thank you very much to all of you who've been asking questions. And if you've given us your name, we'll try and come to you and allow you to ask your questions individually. And just to give a heads up to that, Charles Robinson, you've got a couple of questions, so I'll come to you in a second if you're happy to answer those questions directly. But I've got a question initially that was, is there a risk that environmental net gain will become a standard refusal argument due to the current requirements and definition ambiguity, i.e. is it a subjective threat that can be tacked onto a refusal notice, much like a landscape impact often is? So I think probably, Andra, that one falls to you if you're happy to have a first crack at that, and you know, maybe hand over to Jim and let him come back on that.
Yes, thank you, John. I would hope that when we come to environmental net gain, there'll be a lot more guidance there for the applicants to be providing the information that's required by the local authority in order to make that decision, to follow through with the decision process. So I can't see that it would necessarily just be tacked on without good reason for it to be a refusal notice. And lots of places will have a variety of different policies within their local plan that will require those environmental net gain issues to be addressed, but maybe separately through different policies. So depending on what the local authority has in place, I would think that they would be able to, that the applicant would be able to know what to provide within their planning submission in order for that to be assessed properly by the case officer. And if they don't believe that there's sufficient information there, or they're not unable to assess it, then there is the potential that it could be refused on that basis, but not just a tacked on refusal issue.
I think from my point of view, one of the key things that I pick up from the principles around this whole area is the need for engagement. And you know, you hope that those sort of discussions are going to be very integral to the things as we go forward. Jim, anything else that you want to pick up on that specific point, or should we go to the next question?
I think you two have covered it, so let's, I think, probably move on.
Okay. Right, we're going to try the technology. Charles, if you're out there and you can, we can unmute you, and if you're happy to ask your question directly, please do so.
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Excellent. We can hear you, Charles. Please crack on, and we'll do our best to answer your quite challenging questions. So if you want to just, I think you've posed a couple. So if you can get those out there, then we'll go from there.
Okay, yeah, they are sort of related as well. I'd like to know the likely cost of this, and whether it's something which we're going to be asked as consultants by developers. You know, do we need yet another professional? Do we need an ecologist, or do we need a specialist to do this? or is it for a simple development, small development, something which the local authority would do, or we could do and make it quite easy? And then the second point is, at what point in the process will it be required? Now, I understand from the last sort of comment that was made, the impression or the intention seems to be that it would be upfront in the planning process. But I can see problems with that, in that a developer will say, well, you know, yet another cost, and it could be quite substantial, before I know if I'm getting support for my planning application, before I know if I'm likely to get a recommendation for approval. But if you then leave it to the tail end part of the planning process, then it's going to have an impact on site viability, because you won't know what the cost of the biodiversity offsetting would be, or anything like that. So it's really just your thoughts on those 2 points.
Okay, well, I'll pass over to Andrew in a second, but just from my point of view, Charles, I think we've got to think about it, you know, we've got to start a new way of thinking. And the main thing is that these discussions have got to start right at the very start of the process. I think in most cases, it's going to require some specialist input. And certainly the deprometric is not something that anybody can pick up and come out with a sensible result, but it will apply right the way through. I think the intention is to make that thinking develop viability and value right from the outset, and try and integrate nature into the development and make sure that the development is thinking about it from day one and working with the grain as much as it can do. But Andra, on the specifics of that, I think I'd pass over to you for a more fuller answer to Charles.
Yes, I'll try and answer it. So around the cost of undertaking the piece of work, one of the slides that Jim put up showed the different thresholds of development and what might be required. And if it's a simple metric for a very small development, then that could be undertaken potentially by an ecologist or someone that knows the site. So it might not be that you need to engage any specialist on that, but the larger the site you get, more detail will be required. Jim might be able to go into the potential costs that would be for say a very large development. And when it would be required in the process, part of that will come down to the Environment Bill. I believe that it's looking at having a lot of the information up front before the local authority can even make a decision. So that is taken out of the hands of the local authority and would be there in national policy, that you would need that, or you'd need those guarantees that you're going to be meeting the 10% gain before the authority can make a legal decision. So that would obviously mean that you have to do some upfront costs on that, but we would envisage that being proportionate to the size of development that you're proposing.
Excellent. I think, you know, it is something that we're going to have to be thinking about right at the start of the process. Now, the next question I've got was from Tony Stones. I don't know, Tony, if you're out there and if you can unmute, or if Vicky can unmute you. Tony, are you out there? If not, I'm happy to ask the question on your behalf. The question was around...
It's there now, John.
All right, okay. Can you hear us, Tony?
Hi,
excellent. Go for it. Go for it. Your question
Jim,
is
I think it's
yours.
probably, thank you. I think it's probably Jim. I'm obviously interested in biodiversity net gain as an ecologist, but I'm interested to know what is applied to small areas in small pocket landscapes in urban areas. Have you come across a scheme for monitoring or a metric that's applicable to that, or is there anything in the industry? Because I don't think there is.
If you're talking about biodiversity assessment, the biodiversity metric 3.0 is supposed to work in small urban areas, but I have to say we've used it in very urbanized areas, and it is tricky, to say the least, because it's not very good at recognizing certain habitats that are quite common, so sort of disused land type habitat. So in theory, you would use the same metric for wherever your location is, and And the idea is that it will work. So the biodiversity metric does now allow you to include things like green roofs and street trees and things like that. But as I mentioned, it is a little bit tricky in sort of derelict land type situations.
But in terms of the scale, what's the smallest type of area you could apply it to?
There's no smaller size at all. You can do it for because the area is literally multiplied by the distinctiveness and condition, and so if you have a small site, then your overall biodiversity score will be quite low. But then so will your before and after scores will equally be low. So your 10% gain will only be a small 10% gain because it'll be relative to the size of the site. So there's no size limit on this.
And is it also applicable to sites that are largely just concrete and hard standing with no biodiversity to start with, or very little?
Yes, I mean if it really is just hard standing, then your biodiversity score will be 0 or very low before the development, and you'll find that you'll probably be able to get some biodiversity in fairly easily. So in some ways, those are quite good sites.
Okay, because I've come across, I have looked into it, and I see that I believe that Natural England have actually trying to incorporate something into the net gain metrics, which looks at sites like the sites I'm working on. Are you aware of that, or?
Well, that's they are trying to get it better for highly urbanized sites, but it's not quite there yet.
Tony, we've got quite a few questions.
Yeah, sorry.
I'm going to move on, but just have a look at the best practice guidance, which was flagged up on one of my slides, because there's some really good urban case study examples in there, and they'll help to answer those questions. And certainly the DEFRA metric is going to be revised, is currently being revised, next version probably September, and I think it'll pick up on a lot of these things. Now, I've got an anonymous question, but I'm just going to ask that, and I'm going to then come to Joe Bradley. So Joe, if you just want to if you are happy to ask your question, we'll come to that. But ahead of that, somebody's asked a specific question about the Tresham Garden Village case study. In other words, was it requested by the planning authority, or was it offered by developers, or a mixture of the two? And I think probably, from my point of view, it was a mixture of the two. The Garden Village proposals have been brought forward together with the landowner, the developer, and the local authority working in partnership. And this was seen as a way of hopefully being able to demonstrate that that project was actually doing what it said it was going to try to do on the tin. But Andra, I don't know if you just want to add a couple of notes to that, and also Jim.
Yes, so we were successful in securing some Homes England funding under their Garden Village scheme. So the project itself was procured by the local authority to undertake that, but as John said, that the estate had already put in quite a lot around tree planting in any case, and you could see from Jim's slides that the first iteration of the master plan was already making some good things. So just by tweaking it towards the end, we were able to get those marginal gains around some aspects, but it was funded through Homes England in that instance through their innovation strands.
Yeah, and I think you know, that hopefully gives clarity to that. Jim, we've got a few more questions, so I'm going to move on. I mean, there's a number of questions around the subject, Joe, that I'm going to come to you if you're available to ask your question. Joe, are you there? This sort of resonates with quite a lot of questions that we're getting. Can you hear? Okay, I think we can hear you. So
yeah, I suppose my question is about the benefit of the habitat that we're creating, whether that benefit should be for the residents of the new homes, or whether we are taking account of the needs of the local wildlife. So whether there's a link to biodiversity action plans and local priority species. So you talk about creating a woodland around the new town that you were talking about in the case study, and I just wondered if there was any measure of whether that woodland was the right thing for the local wildlife, or whether the woodland was selected because that's what people find pleasing, and how we get that balance right between habitats for wildlife and habitats to make the place a nice place.
Yeah, Joe, it's a really good question, and it's been resonated in a number of questions that we've received. This sort of balance between wildlife and place and people, and you know, I picked it up in the very early, sort of notes that I was saying just to introducing Jim. It's always going to be a balance, and I think we want to make sure that we are looking at the needs of the wider environment. And this is why I think environmental net gain is so important. Biodiversity is certainly going to be the first hurdle, and the Environment Bill will put that in as a mandatory hurdle. So it's undoubtedly going to come up people's agenda, and it's going to need to be addressed in a really integrated way. But we also need to be thinking about people, and making sure that these things work effectively together, I think, is going to be key. But Jim, do you want to pick up on that a little bit? And then Andra, I'll come to you, because I'm sure you've got some thoughts from your perspective. So Jim.
Yes, I agree with that. It's very much a balance, and it's about seeing what's important where as well. So if we have a location which is high for biodiversity, and that biodiversity is potentially could be disturbed, then we're not talking about opening up access everywhere. That's the sort of location that needs to be protected from too much public access. But what we can start to do is thinking about using some of the planting new areas or whatever, where you could encourage people to take pressure away from those areas which are prone to disturbance. So it's not about all for wildlife or all for people. It's about a sort of balance, and not even a balance in each place. It's about a sort of spatial way of approaching this, where certain things are important in certain locations and certain other things are important in other locations. And having public access right next to houses is really, really important. That will get most used, and that will also take pressure away from potential wildlife sites which might be slightly further away from houses.
Andra, just a couple of quick comments from you, and then we'll move on to some more questions. And just as reassuring people, we'll try and get some answers back to other key questions after the event if we don't have a chance to pick them up in the event itself.
So yeah, just going back to Joe's question, a lot of it will depend on the evidence that you have locally. So some of the work that we've done in Northamptonshire or Northamptonshire wider is about the wider ecosystem services, what the opportunity mapping is for different habitats, and what those priority sites are across the area. So if your development is near to those and there is a need for more wildlife protection, then that is the direction that you go for that particular development. So it's ensuring that the local authority has that right evidence base in the first place in order to make those decisions. And what we're also looking at for our natural capital SPD that was briefly mentioned is that we'll be looking at prioritising the biodiversity net gain over the natural capital to ensure that we can get that almost step change in North Northamptonshire to protect that biodiversity in the first instance. And just going back to Tresham, I believe, John, that the woodland was not planted just because it was nice to have for people. It was buffering some of the triple SIs that were nearby. It was it's part of the Rockingham Forest, so it's providing a patchwork of woodland across the site that could then link in as corridors to other areas. And some of it is open to, or is planned to be open to the public. Others bits will be closed off just for the biodiversity and habitat.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. It was planted and designed with a lot of objectives, not least water quality in the nature improvement area and improving the water quality and the runoff onto the Willowbrook. We've had a number of questions around the costs of maintenance and so on, and I'm just going to read out an anonymous question, and then after that, Andy Duncan, I've got you on the list of questions, so I'll come to you in a minute if I can, Andy. But this anonymous attendee, who will be responsible for any ongoing management maintenance required to deliver the enhanced ecosystem services? How will this be paid for? Lump sum to the developer or ongoing annual payment? So who wants to pick up that sort of rather tricky little question? Jim, I'm going to come to you first, and Andra, I'd certainly like a little bit from you if I can. Jim.
Yeah, thanks for that.
I knew you'd be pleased.
This is an interesting point. And something that we're exploring and needs to be explored further, there are a whole series, there are different ways that this could potentially be funded going forward. And we, yeah, I suppose the short answer is we haven't worked out the best way of doing this, but there are possibilities of setting up some sort of, I mean, I should just go back a step. We have to, the developer has to pay for maintenance for 30 years for this kind of work. That's part of the new policy that's coming up. So, but whether that is the developer carries on paying for 30 years, that probably seems unlikely. So it's more likely that they will pay money near the start of the project that will then get spread out over the 30 years by as part of a fund. But the details are very much work in progress, and I don't know if Andra knows more about this side of things.
No, I don't know an awful lot more. I would say that the same, it's the 30 years for the developer to be covering the costs of that, be it through a management company or through a contribution to the town or parish council, whoever might want to be taking on that site. So there will be lots of discussions that would need to be had at the time on that, and I'm sure things will evolve as this starts to become more mainstream.
I think it's right. One of the key things, though, is that often, if it's thought about early enough, if it's designed right, if it's integrated right, the cost of the maintenance can be managed effectively. Often assets such as woodland in particular does not necessarily just need to be a cost, it can be a productive asset. We need to be thinking about productive open space as well, so something to think about. Now I've got I think it's Sebastian Charles with the hand raised, but also I've got Andy Duncan's question. Andy, if you're there, we'll try and unmute you if you're still there, and if you'd like to ask your question, because it's a particular one that I'm interested in about stacking of benefits.
Can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can, Andy. Thank you very much.
Good. No, back in the sort of early days of ecosystem services, everyone was talking about stacking and bundling of ecosystem services, and it was all a holy grail. And yet I'm very worried now that biodiversity net gain and natural capital net gain, there's a risk of acting in their own little bubble. And woodland carbon guarantees, I went on the ICF training day for woodland carbon guarantee, and that specifically said, you've got to be additional. Everything's got to be there's a lot of additionality built in, and yet we're therefore going to miss good opportunities for stacking ecosystem benefits. Like a BNG metric will very much mitigate against woodland planting. You won't score many biodiversity units, and yet your natural capital net gain obviously shows woodland providing lots and lots of ecosystem service benefits. Yeah. So how can we get it together?
We're coming to the end of our time, Andy, but I'll answer very quickly if I can. One of the things around this is it is one of the main challenges that people have got at the moment. And a lot of things people are thinking very closely about this. Certainly woodland creation should not exclude the opportunity for biodiversity, should not exclude the opportunity for carbon. But you need to be thinking about it, you need to register it right at the start of the process, you need to be integrating it into those. And there's going to be a lot of water that needs to go under the bridge to get these, to get this cleared. But it is critical, I think, for a lot of landowners, in particular people who are thinking about maybe delivering sort of biodiversity projects and other things, and are thinking about what they can do to maximize environmental net gain. They're going to need to understand where those revenue streams are going to be and how they're going to be able to blend those together. We've also got the environmental land management scheme coming on. How is that going to interact with some of these other issues? So it's a really good question. I think it's something that you've got to be keeping in very close contact with and talking to the policymakers about it. Now we are coming up to the end of our time, and we have got a lot of questions stacking up, but I do want to draw the event to a close now. Thank you very, very much to everybody who's joined us today. In particular, thanks to Jim and Andra for their excellent contributions, and to Vicky behind the scenes, who's been doing a great job. What we'll do with regards to the questions that have come through as we've been on the event is Jim and Andra and myself will have a bit of a look through those, and If we can come back to you and answer some of those, we will do. If we can't, then we will certainly, you know, our details are available, and please feel free to contact us outside of this event. The recording or a recording of the proceedings and just copies of the presentations, because people have been asking about that, they will all be made available, and we'll also try and put in a couple of key links to some useful documents associated with this that hopefully people will be able to tap into and will get value out of. So I'm going to draw the session to a close now. Thank you very, very much indeed for joining us this morning. I hope you found it useful. I hope you found it informative, and I hope it sort of got you thinking about what you need to be doing in relation to your particular projects. Going back to the poll that we ran, a lot of people thinking that it's something that's absolutely key to their projects and something that they need to be thinking about going forward. But I think we were looking earlier at not a lot of people actually engaging with the process maybe as much as we thought. So hopefully that will start to change, and you know, we'll see that. And in any way any of us can help, we'll be delighted to do so. So thank you very much for your time. Have a very enjoyable rest of the day, and keep safe, and we look forward to catching up on some of the future webinars that we hope to run in over the next few months as we get better at this. So thank you very much for your time. We're also going to send out just a quick questionnaire to say what have you liked about it, what do you think we could do better. Always good to get your feedback. So if you can spend a couple of minutes just giving us a bit of feedback, that'd be great. So thank you for now, and have a good rest of the day.